enjoy your course.
Right, good morning, and thank you for coming to this course. Switch it on. Exploration is really the essence of the human spirit. Don't worry, you're not in the wrong course. This is just to introduce the subject of a lot of what I'll be talking about is because of the spirit of exploration in people. Gave rise to this collecting birds over the centuries and then naming them to find out what they were and continuing to study how these birds relate to one another. And so although nowadays we can go into the outer reaches of space, a few hundred years ago it was very different, and people had to use sailing ships to explore new countries. But first, just what gave me the idea of this course is in about 2014, I started becoming interested in how the different weaver birds were found and described. And I did a weekly web series. So there are 117 weaver species recognized currently. That keeps changing a bit. But so it took me 117 weeks, week after week, choosing a new species, well, from the first to be described right through to the last. And that is still available on the UCT webpage, so you can go and look at more details for every single species, who described it and how it was found, and so on. But we go back to the 1400s when Henry the Navigator first decided that it was time to get to India via a sea route. And of course, there was no idea of the size of Africa or how to get past Africa to India. But a few successive ships or explorers managed to, eventually with Vasco da Gama, to get to India. And that opened the route for more and more Portuguese, and of course then the Dutch, and later the English, and many other nations to go and explore and to obtain this wealth of from minerals to new birds and all sorts of other trade. As these ships were going around the coast of Africa, they had to stop off for provisions, and they would see all these new birds and plants and animals and take them back to Europe, where of course they were completely unknown. And the wealthy people would buy these and keep them in cabinets, either dead or alive, as was the case. So, for instance, here's just one Italian wealthy person that had this vast array of birds, including the bird highlighted there, the southern red bishop. And in these early days, many of these birds were just named as coming from Africa or from somewhere. And in fact, they even got it wrong sometimes, saying the bird's from India, even though it was actually, the ship came from India, but stopped off along the coast of Africa somewhere and picked up some birds. But our story really starts with Carl Linnaeus. He was lived in Sweden, and he was the person that first formalized the naming of these different species. So it's all very well that already for a few hundred years, 200 or 300 years, people had been bringing back all these strange animals and plants, but how to name them, how to keep track of them, how to catalog them. And so in this, if we just look here, where I talk about people that collected weaver birds, you'll see in the corner there, author of 9 weavers, and for Linnaeus, I'll be going through each of those in detail. I won't be going through all the weavers. There are just too many for this course. I've tried to summarize things in just more interesting ways. And the person that collected the most weavers is Andrew Smith, and we'll hear about him tomorrow. So he is ranked first, Linnaeus second. So he was the first person to formally describe birds and animals and plants. And for the weavers specifically, he described 9 species. And we'll look at how he managed to do that without even having set foot in Africa. So the material I've used here comes from our own photographs. For each weaver species, I've tried to choose one of the earliest illustrations that was published, just for the interest to set the tone of the time. Even though I may have photos of the species as they look today, it's just more interesting to see those. And a lot of those are freely available on Wikipedia, as well as Biodiversity Heritage Library and also other sites. The same for the collectors. So there would be people collecting weavers or birds, as well as those describing them formally and writing up about them. Right, so back to Carl Linnaeus. And he designed this binomial nomenclature. And it's not him that came up with the idea. There were people before him that had thought of that, but different people had different ideas. He was the first one that took this and formalized it and used it on a very large scale. And so he described birds with a genus. That's the first part, grouping similar animals or plants together, and then the species name, which is uniquely identifies one kind of animal. He started writing a series of books, with subsequent editions, Systema Natura, and the first was in 1735. It was very short, had a few plants that he described, 12 pages, and he kept adding to new editions, and by the time he had written the 10th edition in 1758, he had already included over 7,000 plants and over 4,000 animals, of which of those animals, there were 1,000 birds, and of those, 714 are still valid today. In some cases, there were duplicates, or species he described as actually a synonym of another species, and things like that, or they've been lumped subsequently. So, and of course, of these, as you've heard already, 9 of those 714 birds are weaver birds. And these are the 9 species. As I said, these are not illustrations by Linnaeus. His book didn't have any illustrations at all, simply a short description and a name, scientific name. But either he found these illustrations and referred to them, and I'll describe that a bit, or they were illustrated in later years. So the first one is the black-winged bishop, and of course all of these were described in the same publication, but I've put them in sequence of how they appeared chronologically within the publication. But these are the first 5 weavers to have been described. And what he did was he was looking to describe as many plants and animals as possible. So he visited people in Sweden who had cabinets of all these different animals, as well as relying on books that had been published by other people. And he spent 9 weeks over a period of a few years at the King of Sweden's residence, where he had a large number of living birds as well as specimens. And sometimes the birds, of course, eventually die and then would also be prepared as specimens. And in this particular case, the specimen is still around. We don't know who collected this fire-crowned bishop. We don't know where it came from. Somewhere in Africa, probably Senegal, one of the places where it occurs. But the specimen is remarkably well preserved. That's not true of many other specimens. Many hundreds, if not thousands, have disappeared in various ways since they were collected at first. Right, the second one is the black-throated weaver. This one comes from India, and Linnaeus found it. No, he didn't. It was in the collection of an entomologist in England, and 2 artists both illustrated this species. And on Thursday, I'll be talking a lot more about the different artists, including Albin and Edwards. But anyway, they produced books. Edwards a few years later, about 10 or 15 years after Albin. And Linnaeus had access to these books and described this species, among others as well. So what happened is these two artists, they wrote about these birds. In fact, they called this one the Indian passer. Passer just meaning sparrow. And that's not a scientific name by any means, gave it an English name, and a long description, a full page of the habits and plumage of this bird, and the same for all the other species that they had illustrated. So they had illustrated a bunch of birds from the collection of Dandridge, as well as from other people living in England. Now, if you look at a modern field guide, you might be surprised that the male black-throated weaver looks like this, and you'll see that it's got a black throat, whereas this doesn't. But if you get a good field guide with lots of illustrations of the same bird, you'll see that there is a less common variation with a whitish mask and a black collar, and that's exactly what you see here. This is a much better illustration, and these are probably the same birds, although because there's a difference of about 10 years between Albin and Edwards in their publications, it could be that, we don't know, but that Dandridge was breeding these birds, and that, so these were birds that were not the same individuals as these, but certainly the same variant. Right, then the third species that Linnaeus described was the yellow-backed weaver, and again, this was in the aviary of this person in England, and once again, it's a bird that Albin found and illustrated, and Linnaeus only saw the painting of this bird, not the actual bird. Then the southern red bishop. Here, at least we know that this bishop came from Angola, where it is quite common still today, as it is in southern Africa, and it was in the collection of George Salvok. And in this case, George Edwards had found it and painted it. So both these artists went to different collections, and sometimes they painted the same birds, and other times they found, so as birds were coming and dying, there would just be different birds available in these collections. And also, these collectors would sell birds sometimes and swap and things like that. So it wasn't something that you could just go and look at and expect to see all the time in a person's collection. Then the red-billed quelea is the fifth and last species that Linnaeus described in his 1758 edition. And this bird we know was collected by Michel Ada and illustrated by Brizon. Now, Brizon is a French author who only published his book in 1760. So that's only 2 years later. But obviously it would have taken him some time to prepare. He had an artist, Martinet, who was illustrating as many of the species as possible, and he was writing extensive long paragraphs about each species as much as possible. So it's only to be presumed, so Linnaeus referenced Brizon without a date or anything, just said he sourced Brizon, so it must be a draft copy that he had seen since it hadn't been published yet. But now let's talk about Michel Ada, and he's best known. He was a French botanist working in Senegal, on the west coast of Africa, and he wrote a long paper on the whole phenology of the baobab tree, and Linnaeus is the person that first gave a scientific description for the baobab, and he chose the surname of this collector and used the surname to create the genus for the baobab species. But even though he was mainly a botanist, Addison was also very interested in other plants and animals, and he collected these two species, the red-billed quelea, as I mentioned, and he sent it off to France, where Brizon illustrated and wrote about it. In later years, he also collected the village weaver, but that didn't appear in time for Linnaeus to describe. So that was only described quite a bit later by someone else. So Linnaeus' 1758 edition was so popular that people started sending him more and more plants and animals from all over the world. And so he continued with his editions. In 1766, the 12th edition is where he had a whole lot of new weaverbird species included, as well as listing the ones he had listed in his previous edition. And he had so many animals and plants coming in, he had to devise a card index system to keep track of everything. He didn't have computers like we have today, the luxury as well as sometimes curse of being able to use computers. And so he had to put everything on cards and keep carefully file them to be able to write his books. And these are the 4 species in his second edition. And although he received lots of species himself personally, he still relied heavily on new books that were being published all the time and cataloguing different birds and plants and animals. And just by chance, the 4 new weavers that he described were all from the book by Brizon, which was published in 1760. So 2 years after Linnaeus' first or 10th edition of his book. But now I have to take a step backwards in time. There was a French entomologist, René, and at this point I just want to apologize that I do not know how to pronounce a lot of these names. So anyone here who knows some French may be laughing at me at my pronunciation. That's fine, at least you can see the spelling and know who I'm talking about. My first language is German. English is my second language, and at one point I really tried to learn French, but it was a dismal failure. So this guy, René, had one of the largest collections in his time, the 1750s and 60s, of zoological animals from all over the world, and including America, Africa, and Asia. And he relied on people like Adamson, who I mentioned earlier, to send samples to him. He was wealthy enough to be able to purchase whatever came his way, and also Boddaert, who I'll come to a bit later. And in 1749, he entrusted his collection, especially of the birds, to one of his relatives, through his distant relative via his wife's nephew or something like that, Brizon. And this is the person that was the first major cataloguing of vast numbers of species other than Linnaeus. Okay, so I'll come to Brizon in a moment. The other correspondent that René had was Pieter Boddaert, who was a French horticulturist. He was the administrator of Mauritius and Réunion, which is over here in the Indian Ocean. And of course, there were all these ships passing by, stopping off on the way to India, and he decided to take a holiday in 1753 and visited the east coast of India, where he collected a bunch of birds, including the Baya weaver, one of the most common weavers in India. And in later years, he visited Madagascar and collected the Madagascar fody. He sent these off to France, being French, where René obtained them, and later Brizon was able to study these collections. So Brizon published his first book of 6 volumes, over 4,000 pages, in 1760, trying to catalogue every known bird with extensive descriptions. Linnaeus always just provided an incredibly short description, just a sentence or two with where the bird came from, what the distinguishing features were, and what his source was. So he always listed a source where he relied on a book from someone else, so at least one could go back and see more detail in that book. Brizon was amazing. He even wrote his text in French and Latin on the same page, but he did make a mistake. So one would wonder, why did he describe all these many birds that had not been described before? He also included descriptions of birds that Linnaeus had described already. And the thing to do is to look at the names he provided. First a comment here. He also liked describing the biology of the birds as far as possible, where he obtained information from the people who sent these birds, which was not often, but he kept telling these people living or traveling to far-off lands, please look at the biology of the birds. And he also tried to collect at least a male and female where possible. So Boddaert, when he visited India, had not only collected the bioweaver, he also collected the nests, which were sent back to this collection, nests of the bioweaver. And these are the first illustrations of any weaver bird nest ever, at least in Western literature. I have no idea if there's something in the ancient Asian or Indian writings or not, or artwork. Right, so just to look at the other species briefly. So we know that the bioweaver and the Madagascar red fody were collected by Boddaert, and the Cape weaver was found in the collection of a French parishioner, and this must have come from Cape Town, but we don't know any further details of that. Of course, it's listed as type locality as somewhere in the Cape. And then also, we do know a bit more about the yellow bishop that also ended up in Remuer's collection. And that was collected by Louis de Cail, very well known in Cape Town history. He was a French astronomer, and he visited for 2 years to calculate the radius of the Earth in the southern hemisphere. And so he traveled up to Aora and did his measurements, and was also interested in natural history. And so he sent off a few bird specimens, including the yellow bishop, which is very common around Cape Town. And just to remind you of the whole sequence, so he sent it off to Remuer. Brisson then catalogued this whole massive collection, but as I mentioned, why is he not credited as the author of these species? Because Linnaeus is credited with them sometime later. And what we do is look at the names that Brisson provided. And he provided French names. He was totally against the Linnaean system. And this was a very unfortunate fact of many of the French ornithologists for at least another 50, 60 years after that as well, that they just refused to accept the binomial system. And so they lost out a lot in being credited as author of these different species. And so you may think that, well, but this looks like a kind of like a Latin name. And yes, it does. But the problem is that he was actually using this as a French name, just like you would say yellow bishop, he was saying, or bioweaver in this case. That's just the French name. It's not a Latinized name, even though it resembles a Latin name. But you can see very clearly here, it just means weaver from the Cape of Good Hope, and here something similar, finch from the Cape of Good Hope. So when Linnaeus looked through all of Brisson's volumes, 6 volumes, he just took all these species and simply provided Latin names, and is thus credited as the formal describer of these species, even though he just wrote a short sentence saying and referring to Brisson, while Brisson had written paragraphs of information as much as he knew about each one of these species. So these are the 9 species that Linnaeus catalogued for the weavers, and of course hundreds and hundreds of other birds and plants in his System Natura. The next person of interest, and I'm now just going to go through a few different people that have collected some weavers where there's some interesting stories. And this guy, Comte de Buffon, he was also a French naturalist, and he took over the gardens and cabinets of the Jardin du Roi, which eventually became the Paris Museum. And so this grew into the largest collection in France. So as I mentioned, René, this other guy, had the largest collection, but it was eventually transferred to the Jardin du Roi as a more permanent home. It was transferred a few years later after Brizon had started cataloguing everything. He only published in 1760, so he only finished after it had been transferred, but he already had all his information. And unfortunately, these two guys became bitter enemies because Buffon then wrote his own catalogues, but birds as well as all the other animals, this is only a few years later, but new species were arriving at such a rapid rate that there was scope to rewrite things every few years. And so it took him over a decade to complete the bird volumes, and then he still did other animals and plants as well. And because it was such a massive undertaking, just trying to keep up with all these animals and birds coming in, he had an artist who just illustrated the species, and those were published first as what's called here the planches illumines, or whatever, however you pronounce that. So it was just the plates that were illustrated, and then as he had time, he would publish the actual books. And again, he made the same mistake. He did not provide Latin names. He only provided French names. Maybe it's something about the French wanting to only have French names. But he certainly described or included 4 new weaverbird species, and I'll talk a bit about these according to who collected them. Here you can see the village weaver, which I mentioned earlier. It was the second species that Adamson had collected in Senegal. But he only collected it a few years later, so it arrived in time for Buffon to include. It was too late for Linnaeus to know about. Now, Pieter Boddaert was a Dutch naturalist, and what he did was he believed in the Linnaean system, and he looked through all these plates that had been published. The artist was Dorbenton, working together with Buffon to try and illustrate as much as possible. And Pieter Boddaert simply looked at all the plates and provided Latin names in a catalogue. He did nothing more than that, but that's sufficient for him to be credited as the author of all those species, and that included 2 weavers, the long-tailed widow and the red-collared widow. Now, the long-tailed widow, we don't know who collected it, obviously from South Africa somewhere, although it also occurs in Kenya and other places, but the subspecies that was collected was the one from South Africa. The red-collared widow was collected by Sonorat, and I'll mention him in a moment. It's interesting to note that there's an error in this painting. It's actually the red-collared widow has a red breastband, not this circle. And we don't know why that happened. Probably the bird was molting that was collected. And so the red feathers were still growing and were a bit tatty, and the whole breastband hadn't developed yet, even though the rest of the bird had its breeding plumage. Right, but first, the long-tailed widow has a very interesting origin in its name. The specific name is progne, and that comes from the Pieter Boddaert mentioned that it's because he named it in honor of Procne, daughter of Pandion, one of the Greek legends, and she was transformed into a swallow. Now, Pieter Boddaert wouldn't know much about the behavior of these birds except what had been told him, but we probably all know, if you've traveled up country, how these long-tailed widows flutter over the grasslands very conspicuously, and so we can just presume that it's referring to this fluttering flight, resembling a swallow's flight possibly, that it obtained this name. Right, so now the red-collared widow was named by Pieter Boddaert, who is more well known for being the describer of the lychee tree from China, and he collected that there and wrote about it. Also, when Pieter Boddaert visited Madagascar, he was with a guide who pointed out and said, look, when he saw these Indri lemurs. And of course, Boddaert thought that he meant that was the name, whereas it's just, Indri is the Malagasy word for look. But to this day, this lemur, which I've seen in Madagascar, is named the Indri as the common English name. But of course, it still has the same reaction. When I was with my wife and our guide in Pyrenees forest, basically it's exactly what happened there as well. We actually did hear the lemurs first. That's what normally happens because they're so vocal and so loud. But the guide did say, look, there it is, as soon as we saw it. So it's rather interesting that it's look, and it's the name of the Indri. There it is. We can see it. Pieter Boddaert did not only collect the red-collared widow, which, strangely enough, the type locality is also an error. It was listed as coming from the Far East, but of course that's just a mistake for actually probably the Eastern Cape. So we don't know where he collected it, but he may have either stopped off in the Eastern Cape somewhere and collected it or obtained it from someone when he was passing by there. He also described the Nelly Corvy's weaver, which is also from Madagascar. All right, then there was a German, Gemlin, and he continued Linnaeus' work in exactly the same style. So he described a large number of birds that were coming through to Germany by correspondence working for German collectors or scientists. And he also just gave a very short description and source for the birds that he described. He described 4 weavers, and here they are: yellow mantled weaver, golden-backed bishop, yellow-crowned bishop, Mauritius fody. These are birds that come from all over. I mean, golden-backed bishops restricted to Angola. The yellow-crowned bishop found all over Africa, but the Mauritius fody obviously just from Mauritius. Right, then the sociable weaver, of course, has got an interesting story. William Patterson was one of the early explorers going up north. Of course, he wasn't the first to travel this route from Cape Town north towards the Orange River. There were many people who had already traveled this route before him. But he's the first person to have gone far enough to see the first sociable weavers. And he must have crossed the Orange River, because you don't get sociable weavers when you're traveling straight up north past Springbok on this side of the border. You do if you travel further east, but he would have crossed the Orange River and found these incredibly strange nests and unique birds that just totally different to anything that any European had seen before. And so he wrote in his diary, and he compared it to an aerial city because of the way these birds flew up into the nest. The chambers are at the bottom. Probably most of you know what a sociable weaver nest looks like. So he sent these birds off to England, being Scottish, where John Latham is the person that described it as a new species. But it was not long after, this was 1779, and it was only around, about 10 years later, that Levaillant travelled the same route and also found the sociable weaver. So Francois Levaillant is one of the most well-known collectors in South Africa. He's considered the father of ornithology because he's the first person that was specifically collecting birds and writing about them. Many people before him, like Burchell, Burchell came after him, but earlier people like that had been in South Africa were collecting birds, but just as they were collecting anything and just sending it off with no further interest to Europe. He did 2 trips, and the first was along the eastern coast and then up north to the Orange River. There's been lots of controversy in earlier decades if he did reach the Orange River or not, but it's quite clear that he certainly did. He started writing massive volumes about the birds with illustrations as well, but none of them contain any weaver birds at all. I think that he had meant to still continue writing more volumes and including them, but he certainly collected weavers, quite a few different species, some of which had been named already, but 2 that had not been named before. So the southernmost weaver, and this is the specimen in the Leiden Museum in Netherlands that Levaillant collected. So also perfect condition. I've seen it. This is my photograph. And he collected 2 males, which he described. Unfortunately, there's a lot of controversy about exactly where he collected it. He wrote Namakwaland, but we think that's an error because the masked weavers in Namakwaland are smaller, different subspecies. And so we think that's just an error over time that occurred, but that he actually collected these in the Eastern Cape on his first trip. He also collected the dark-backed weaver, and both of these birds he, as I mentioned, did not write about. He just never got to it. He also does not mention them in his diary. But in his diary, he didn't really write much about birds. He wrote about the people and experiences and so on. But in his massive volumes, and he also wrote a volume about parrots, incredibly detailed about the biology of the different birds. But unfortunately for me, he never got to write a single word about any of his weavers. But with the one exception of the sociable weaver. So in his diary, he mentions these birds. He did not illustrate this nest, but this is quite an error because here you can see it sideways. So he just told, he didn't even have a sketch, his artist that it's a thatch roof with entrances, and the artist got it all wrong, putting it sideways and a bit square rather than rounded or all sorts of different shapes. But the most fascinating thing is that when Levaillant first found the sociable weaver nest, he went up to it, and he must have climbed onto his wagon or something to reach up into the nest and put his hand into a whole lot of different chambers. And in the one chamber that he put his hand into, he got bitten. And he writes in disgust how he pulled out this bird biting him and described this parrot, the rosy-faced lovebird. And these lovebirds he also sent off to Europe, where they were described as a new species. So he found the first rosy-faced lovebirds, and he found them nesting inside the sociable weaver nest. So this is a topic that I'm very interested in, different birds nesting inside weaver nests. Weaver nests are so incredibly well built and well adapted to the environment that other birds use them as well for breeding and roosting sometimes. And it's one of my research avenues that I've published on. But this is the very first case in any recorded medium of one species using the nest of a weaver bird. So at least Levaillant scores very high points in my books because of that. All right, so if we look at the 20 weavers that were described up to 1800, from the time of Linnaeus in 1758. This chart shows the red line is the number of weavers described over all time, compared to the number of all bird species. Now, of course, in blue, this chart you have to look on the right-hand side because it's obviously going to be many more birds, but it's just scaled down to see the pattern. And you can see that It just follows a very similar trend, and I haven't analysed the collectors and that why, but there are these peaks. Of course, it's by decade and not by year, so it also depends on how one plots these things. But the number of weavers described very closely follows the number of all birds described, excepting for this peak here, but we'll come to that later in this course. So it's just to illustrate that there are 117 species of weaver. The first 20 were described in the first 50 years or so, 40 years or so, from Linnaeus onwards. And that is my final slide, and I am happy to take questions. Oh, sorry, I finished a little bit earlier than expected. I wasn't sure on how long I would be talking for, so I'm happy to discuss anything that I've covered today or anything else that's relevant to this time period. Yes? Yes.
Are weaverbirds over the whole globe?
No. And sorry, that's something I didn't think of to talk a bit about, but that's a very good question. So there are 117 weavers, and most of those are found only in Africa. There are 5 species found in southern Asia, so it's a very small group of very distinct weavers. And then there are a whole bunch of weavers on the Indian Ocean islands. They are called the Fodies. So there's the Mauritius Fodie, Seychelles Fodie. I'll be talking a bit about them on my last day because of where they fit into the weaverbird family. It's just very interesting. But it's largely an African group of birds. I consider the Indian Ocean islands kind of like part of Africa, but then you do have these few Asian species. So in this whole course, a lot of what I'll be talking about relates to the discovery of weavers and a bit about the discovery of birds in Africa. I won't be talking at all about America, Australia, or anywhere else, although they're involved. So there's one person, John Casson, who was a museum worker in the States, and he never visited Africa, but he received birds specimens as well, and he described lots of weavers. So although he never came to Africa, people later on started sending, in the beginning, as I've described today, all the early birds only went to Europe, all the different birds and creatures, but slowly in America in the 1800s, people started becoming interested in birds from other parts of the world. Of course, they were collecting birds in the States and America, and initially those went to Europe as well, but then after some time they started keeping them in America, building museums, and started getting things coming there. So as Americans went to different parts of the world, they'd bring their stuff back there. Or in one case, even a collection went to England, but then was bought by the American Museum in Philadelphia before all the things had been described. And so John Casson got to describe those first. So I hope that answers your question, but feel free to ask more about weavers as well. Yes. Okay. No. So, and the one thing I haven't done deliberately is explain the whole process of taxonomy and systematics, but I'll be touching on different aspects through the course. But what I will say about the weavers is, so the way that birds were described, and of course in the early years, people put some weavers in completely different groups, but mostly still similar groups. So the finches, weavers, all of them have always been considered part of this larger finch seed-eating type of group, even though some of the weavers have slightly longer beaks and are insect specialists. But the skeletons are very similar. And even though the plumages vary enormously, weavers, often the males have got bright colors, yellow, red, as you've seen in some of the illustrations already, but the females often are dull colored. In some species, the females are also brightly colored. But the weavers are a fairly consistent group in terms of their skeletal structure. And in the early years, people would use plumage, skeletons, including the beak shape, to classify birds and where they fit in. So, but of course errors were made, and people would put the cuckoo finch in with the weavers, which today we know is not. It's a finch. But it's a related family. The finches and the weavers are not too far apart, at least. So there have been lots of changes in the number of weavers that were considered part of the weaver family. Now you get the true weavers, and that's the vast bulk of the family of 117 species, and they all weave. So they weave this fantastic round nest using their bill and their feet, and they push the material through. They use green grass mostly. One exception is the red-headed weaver, which uses vines or leaf petioles and twigs and things like that, and the dark-backed weaver uses vines and creepers and twigs. But mostly they use green material and build this really well-constructed, very strong nest, which is why other species like sometimes using the weaver nests. But then there are some arid species, the buffalo weavers, the sparrow weavers, and they've sometimes been classified with the sparrows and then brought back to the weaver family. They're kind of like a bridge between the sparrows and the weavers, and they do not weave their nests, but they use grass, and they push the grass into the nest. Similar to a sparrow, it's not weaving, but it's just building a base platform and then pushing in more and more grass in a very direct way, a certain way, so that it forms a dome that's reasonably well constructed. Okay. Yes?
Would you consider that the family started maybe several thousand years ago from, say, one kind of bird?
Yes.
And then it has developed over the many
Yes.
centuries
Yes.
to these 117 varieties?
Correct. Yes, yes. So the origin is certainly considered to be the African savanna. And now, of course, you do have forest species that evolved and some that moved into Asia and also to the Indian Ocean islands. But the origin is considered to be one probably weaver species in Central Africa, or East Africa rather, in the savanna area. And certainly Uganda still has the highest, around Lake Victoria in fact, has the highest diversity of weaverbird species. Cape Town, the least variety. There are about 4 weaverbird species here. So the origin is in East African savanna, from where they spread out, diversified, evolved, and so on.
And is water always a major component
No.
of the environment?
No. So very much a savanna species where they do need some water, but they're not restricted to water. Weavers happily build in trees away from water, but they definitely love water. So if it's available, they will choose to build over water as a protective mechanism. So weavers build their nests in a conspicuous site, and it's for the males to attract the females. And many of the species are polygynous. It means one male wants to attract lots of females. Some species are monogamous. And so in building lots of conspicuous nests, it means predators can see the nest. And so they have to try and make sure predators can't get to the nest too easily. And that's by building over water, building in thorn trees, building at the end of the twigs for the true weavers. Buffalo weavers, sociable weavers, it's not at the end of the twig, but they have stronger nests that are harder to access. So, but they certainly like water from a protective aspect, and then it does provide green material, so it's a bonus. They've got green grass growing in the wetland, insects for the young, and so on. So they certainly do, but you can get weavers breeding in arid areas far away from water as well. They're very adaptable. Weavers have also adapted to human environments to a very large extent, and so weavers generally have increased in numbers of actual birds to a very large extent. There are exceptions. There are some weavers that are very rare. The Mauritius fody nearly became extinct, and some of the other fodies as well, and some of the other weavers are also incredibly rare, where they've got very restricted ranges, and I'll be talking about some of that later. Maybe I'd like to ask, who's interested in birds in general? You'd consider yourself a birder or interested in birds. Okay. Most of you, right. Anyone interested in taxonomy, the discovery of animals or the naming of animals? Anyone? So one or two, a few, but so it's more, you hear more for the bird aspect maybe than the historical aspect. I'll try and take that into account. I have spoken in summer school sessions a few years ago about the breeding biology of birds, and that was popular. The hall was filled, but I really wanted to experiment with bringing in history, geography, taxonomy, and all these different aspects and explore this. My interest is still mainly the weaverbirds and birds, but explore this area, just looking at them in this different way. But I'll try and keep a bit of interesting things about the birds and the rest of the course. Yes. Right. I became interested in birds in high school, and in our garden, I lived in Dundee in northern Natal, and there were masked weavers breeding in the garden, and they were a bit more interesting than the bulbuls and the doves and the sparrows, a bit more colourful and interesting nests and so on, and that's where my interest started, with the southern masked weaver. And then as I started studying them, I wanted to know about the other weavers as well, and my interest spread to the whole family. But still, I love all birds, but weavers a bit more, maybe a lot more. Oh, right. I will be talking about that later, but I'll briefly say because of exotic animals that were brought in, rats, pigs, goats, things like that, and these nests were often low. Island birds often are not adapted to cope with predators because there weren't mammal predators on the islands historically. Barry?
You showed a picture there that the type specimen is roughly 250 years old. What do they do to preserve?
Right. Different ways have been used to preserve these specimens, and arsenic turned out in these early days to be the best method. Now, of course, often they didn't know what would last for hundreds of years, and so they had to experiment. So arsenic's not very nice to work with. I think nowadays, I actually haven't read up much on this. Borax, I think, is better because it's not as harmful to humans, but it works just as well. But certainly a lot of very old specimens from the 1700s are arsenic. Unfortunately, people experimented with other ways as well, and some of those specimens are gone. They've been eaten up by moths and bugs and things like that. Yes.
How do they care for them now in the museum?
Yeah, certainly with, as I say, I don't know what the best method is now, but certainly mothballs are included. They're in cabinets, that rooms in constant temperature, and in the cabinets they've got these mothballs and they're kept in there. And they sometimes fumigate, if they see any signs of insect activity, the whole museum will be, where the collection part is, not the public part, will be fumigated.
And are the colours still as bright as they?
Generally, yes. The one thing about bird specimens is the first thing to go immediately is the eyes. So they cannot be preserved. Sometimes the taxidermists have put beads, small coloured beads in, which may or may not be the correct colour. Fortunately, often the collectors would write the eye colour, but sometimes mistakes were made. So one has to be very careful with studying eye colour from museum specimens. Now, museum specimens are an amazing resource in many different ways. You can study the molt of birds by looking at a whole long series of bird skins. You can look at, you can even take DNA samples from them. You can do biogeographic studies. There are a lot of amazing things one can do. There are limitations. One can look at plumage variations and subspecific variation and things like that, but you can't study eye colour from museum specimens. But the colours, I think, there can be a bit of fading and abrasion and so on, but generally the colours are fine.
Well, the other thing is that you get a collector like Levaillant, and if you read his book on,
Yes.
on his expeditions,
Yes.
and you see the pictures that he drew in those, you've got these trains of ox wagons taking.
Yes.
Now you're collecting a few specimens of birds. I Are you going to kill them and try and preserve them? You can't. Are you going to put them in cages until you get back to civilization?
Yeah.
It must have been an incredible logistic.
It absolutely was, yes. So although people did sometimes, these weren't the collectors, people did catch birds, or they got locals to catch birds and take back to Europe because they wanted live birds as well. But largely what I'll be talking about is where people went out and shot birds, went out with their ox wagons. This is what Levaillant and Burchell and many other people did. But they had to, firstly, they had to skin them within a day or two. So they'd travel and they'd shoot the specimens. They would then have to, in the evenings, prepare them so they wouldn't rot, especially in the tropical heat, put them in boxes and bring these loads and loads of boxes back. Now, it's fine when you've got small birds like weavers and sparrows and things, but imagine having a coron and an ostrich and birds like that. They take up lots of space. And then these carts or boxes, wooden crates of specimens. And of course, most of these collectors were interested in everything. So it was insects, mammals, birds, whatever they could collect. In later years, it was hunters. They went out hunting for trophies. So that's a bit different. But these early guys especially, they wanted specimens to show Europe what animals existed in the world. And then they would be taken on ship back to Europe. And of course, thousands of specimens got lost. I mean, thousands made it, but through insects, where the animals and birds weren't preserved correctly, sometimes the ship would sink. I mean, disaster, ships that were lost at sea and collections were lost. There's one museum in Lisbon, and it was in the 1960s, I think, so as recently as that. So the specimens had been described and everything, but the museum lost half its collection due to a fire, just a simple fire going through the museum. So those specimens can't be studied today, they're gone, but at least they had been described. I've still got a few minutes for some more questions, if there are any. Comments? Yeah, Barry.
So is it fair to say that these collectors would have been wealthy people?
Not the collectors necessarily. So the people that had collections in Europe were the wealthy too, because they had to purchase them. But the people that collected them could be anyone, and that's what we'll be talking a little bit about over the next few days. I mean, there were soldiers, there were missionaries, there were just biologists, naturalists, and it did become a form of income. So the early explorers went out just to explore and find what was there. Sometimes the trips were funded. Sometimes people went out specifically hoping to sell their collections. So Jules Verreau is the classic example. He set up a big business, him and his brother, and they just went around collecting, buying and selling. So it was a business of also buying and then trying to sell the good copies for a profit. No, specimens mostly.
You said to skin a bird.
Yes. Okay, to skin means what they did was they would shoot the bird and then the inside, and then they'd cut it open and take the insides out because that would rot. And then they would put salt, arsenic or whatever inside because there's still tissues. Even the feathers can be attacked by bacteria, mites and so on. So you put a fine dust coating of arsenic or borax or something to preserve. So the main danger is just that bacteria and parasites and things will eat up the bird. So you have to poison it in a sense so that it won't. And the insides have to be taken out. They'll rot. So that's called skinning. Sorry. Yes, so that varied. So often the skeleton would stay inside. So they'd just take out the soft parts, the innards, and then even add wire where necessary for the wing if they wanted it to stay open, and let it dry. And that would be but most specimens would be in a closed position. It's just if you want to mount it for display. So you have to decide how you want to mount it before it dries out. So that process is called skinning, but it's the skin, skeleton and feathers that remain. Sometimes people collect the stomach samples, but then you put it into alcohol. Sometimes they collected the skeleton because people also wanted to study the skeleton of the different species. And then you discard everything and just keep the skeletal structure. Yes. Oh, yes, yes. So eggs and nests were collected as well, to a lesser extent. I think egg collecting, eggs of all species were collected, but it was just this equivalent to a skin. It was just, this is, to describe the species. Egg collecting only became a